Yuma, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Pene Mathew, and I'm the President and Human Rights Commissioner here at the ACT Human Rights Commission. And I'm delighted to be emceeing our annual Human Rights Day forum at Old Parliament House. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping details about the less famous aspects of this building. We all know what happened 50 years ago on the front steps, but you may not know where the toilets are. So there are accessible all-gender toilets in the corridor to the left as you exit this room. There are also some lovely refreshments outside the room. Just be careful not to drop them on the heritage carpet in this old building if you can. And there should be some time to continue mingling and munching after the forum. If there was to be an emergency, our emergency exits are straight out there, so that's pretty easy. All right, well, I'm delighted now to introduce Auntie Violet Sheridan, a senior Ngunnawal elder, cultural leader and a pillar of the community here in Canberra and the region. She's dedicated her life to promoting healing, unity and cultural understanding through storytelling, ceremony and community engagement. Auntie Violet has worked tirelessly to create spaces where First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians can walk together toward a better future, guided by the principles of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Auntie Violet will give our welcome to country. Thank you, Auntie Vi.
Yuma, hello everybody and welcome. This is my mother's country. My mother is a Ngunnawal woman. My father is a Wiradjuri man, but I follow my matriarch's bloodline. My people have lived here for many years before they decided to make the capital city of Australia and that place on the hill plus the place here. But my family has been removed out of town and we ended up, a lot of us, around Yass and around Queanbeyan and region. So if you're familiar with between Yass and Burrawa, there's a little place called Rye Park. And my great-grandparents ended up out there. They built a mud hut out there, which still stands today. And one other thing that still stands there today too, if you remember, Old Pit Toilet, that still stands out there today. When I used to go out there and visit, I'd pray, please don't let me fall down there, I'll never get out. So that's a little bit about me. I have 4 children and a couple of grandchildren. I've just had a new one. His name's Tatum, and he's got more hair on his head than his pop. So, to welcome to country to me is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners of the land welcome you, but it also shows respect for the first peoples of the land you are meeting on. I suppose it's a little bit about not going to someone else's house or home unless you're welcome and invited. The reason for this custom is to protect your spirit while you're on our lands. I am a proud Ngunnawal woman as I carry my ancestors in spirit, walking into the future, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, my culture, the Ngunnawal Aboriginal culture. I'd like to pay respects to the members of the panel, my elders past, present, and those are emerging. And also I'd like to pay respect to the First Nations people in the room as well, but also the non-Indigenous people in the room as well. I live in Gungahlin and we're like a big melting pot over there at Gungahlin. We've got so many different cultures, and I always say to people, I'm a big supporter of reconciliation. Sit down and have a yarn to someone, because you will not believe that we all different cultures, but we all people, we are humans. The only thing that we have different is our beliefs, what we believe in. But one thing we all got in common is when we cut our finger, we all bleed the same, red. So in keeping in the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure once again to welcome you to the land of the Ngunnawal people. And on behalf of my family and the other animal family, I say welcome, but I would like to wish you all and your families a Merry, Merry Christmas and a happy and safe 2026. I said that about 2025 too. Thank you all so much. God bless.
Thank you, Auntie Violet, for that lovely warm welcome to country. So today is the 77th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration led to two important United Nations treaties, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Many, though not quite all, of those rights have become law in the ACT through the ACT's Human Rights Act. If you were at our forum last year, you might remember we were talking about the right to housing, and I'm very pleased to say, as you all know, that the right to housing will become part of our Act on the 1st of January 2027. Yes, let's cheer for some good news on the human rights front, and it was a bill introduced by the Greens, there were amendments introduced by Labor, but all 25 MLAs voted for it, and I think that's something also really worth celebrating. It's quite remarkable. In addition to these two major treaties, the United Nations has adopted many more human rights treaties that are devoted to particular groups of people. This recognises that while human rights are universal, the way we experience human rights and breaches of human rights can be quite different. These treaties include conventions against racial discrimination and discrimination against women, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Currently, the UN is working towards a convention on the rights of older persons. So today we're going to explore the topic, making rights real for older people. And to do this, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by the Federal Age Discrimination Commissioner, Robert Fitzgerald AM, who will give the keynote address. We'll then have a panel discussion with Sue Hendy, who is co-chair alongside Robert of the Human Rights as We Age Network, and my colleague, Commissioner Karen Toohey, who, amongst many other responsibilities, deals with complaints relating to services for older people, discrimination, retirement villages, and many, many other things. So I'll introduce our keynote speaker first. Robert probably doesn't really need an introduction. He'll be very familiar to most of you, I think. He's had many significant roles over the years, including New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commissioner and Deputy Ombudsman for New South Wales, Commissioner with the Productivity Commission and Commissioner with the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse. A commercial lawyer for more than 20 years, including with top-tier firm Clayton Utz, he's also held a number of policy-related roles, including as a member of the National Competition Council. So we're absolutely delighted that he could join us on Human Rights Day. Please welcome our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Penny, and it's an extraordinary joy to be here. The last time I was in this room, I was just recounting, was with Relationships Australia when they were having their national meeting, so a couple of those people are here today. Thank you so much, Auntie Violet, for the welcome to country. I've been welcomed to this country a lot over a long period of time, and it's always a privilege to be in the room when elders welcome me and others to this land. And today we want to also a special call out for elders and seniors within our Indigenous communities generally. And in many senses, we should acknowledge what happened yesterday, the apology to First Peoples yesterday at the Parliament in Victoria, and of course the recent passing of legislation enshrining a treaty in that state. And they are significant and momentous events. And yet there's a fragility in all of what we've just said. The opposition failed to support the apology yesterday, and has indicated that if elected will remove the rights of the treaty. The Northern Territory government is refusing access to the United Nations working group looking at what's called arbitrary detention, and they won't permit them to go into any of their correctional services or meet with any other government authorities. And in Queensland and Northern Territory and others, the rights of young people are being taken down as we talk. And so many senses in this space, not only for Indigenous people, but for vulnerable people in Australia, we have successes and we move forward, and at the very same time, we have retreats. And this is the world we're in at the moment with rights, and it's extraordinary that we should be in 2025, both in Australia and across the world, fighting for the rights that, as you say, were introduced 77 years ago. I might say it's a great joy to be at ACT, where you had your rights, your Human Rights Act, I think, established, 21 years ago. And what's remarkable about that is, as I was walking up from down the road through the Old Parliamentary Gardens, I saw the statue of Susan Ryan, the former senator, who was, of course, the very first Age Discrimination Commissioner appointed, ironically, 21 years ago. And yet I wonder what she would think about Australia today, where we still do not have a Human Rights Act. And there's no indication at the moment that we're any closer than we were then or are now to having one. 40 years ago next year, the Australian Human Rights Commission was established, and one of the reasons it was established was for the introduction of a Human Rights Act in Australia. Why is it that Australia is the only country in the OECD that doesn't have one? Why is it that ACT, Queensland, Victoria are able to have a Human Rights Bill or a Human Rights Act, all different in character and nature, and yet the Australian government, under all persuasions, is unable to do so? And that's a great challenge, because it says something about Australia. Australia believes it is, in fact, a bastion of human rights. Talk to most people around Australia, and they will say, oh yes, we have human rights, and they believe that they exist in law. But in reality, most of them are not. Most of the rights we think we have are given to us by the governments, both the state and territory and the Commonwealth governments, and can be removed just as easily. And we'll talk about some of those on the panel today. When we look at the topic about making rights real for older persons, there's a couple of things that I think are pretty obvious. The first one is you have to have some, and they've got to be legally enforceable. So the positive news is the United Nations is moving forwards in the development of a convention on the rights of older persons. And Sue, who's going to be on the panel with us, has been part of a rich civil society action for the last 15 years calling for that convention. And suddenly last year, when I was in New York at the United Nations, there was movement out of the working party stage to the Human Rights Council, and now we actually have the beginning of the drafting of a convention which commences in February of next year. And that is good news. For 14 years, Australia sat on the sidelines. It would not commit to a convention, nor would it oppose it. It's very pleasing the Australian government now has agreed that in principle it supports such a convention. And that's an almighty movement in a short space of time, that is the last 12 months. But again, 15 years in the making, and that's good. The second thing is we do talk about rights in Australia, and the Aged Care Reform Act that you're aware of, which saw the introduction of the new aged care system on the 1st of November, is of course a rights-based act. It has 3 pages of statement of rights, and they're a combination of consumer rights and human rights. But then if you go to the very last provision in those 3 pages, it then says they're not enforceable directly at law. So even when we have them, they're not actually directly enforceable at law. That is true in the NDIS legislation as well. So the good news is we're now starting to see legislation throughout Australia, throughout the 9 governments, which do embrace statements of principle, statements of rights. And as I say, they're a combination of human rights and consumer rights. But yet we lack the maturity and the courage of a nation to actually say, let's now make them enforceable. I hope that that would come. But we have to work with those rights or those principles as they stand today. But there's a couple of things I do want to talk about more generally, and the starting point for this is Australia has no narrative around the care and support of older Australians at all. I was recently at several functions, and one of those was about a presenter from Samoa talking about why their young generation supports their older generation, and was framed around 4 things that are common to the national identity or the national values, and they were love, family, faith, and service. And for them, within that context, the notion that you would not support an older person is completely anathema. If we talk to Indigenous people in Australia, they will talk about the respect for elders. And they will talk about it in the nation that they are the culture holders, they are the storytellers, they are the preservers of the past. And many of our other multicultural communities in Australia can tell you about what they believe is the obligation of the whole community to support older people. But when you move beyond that, there is no narrative at all. None at all. We have no dialogue, we have no concepts, we have no obligations. And as we now see Australians starting to live more separately, away from each other, the decline of the extended family, the separation of those who need to care and those who need to be cared for is changing dramatically. So the only narrative I think we can apply for is one around respect and dignity for older people. And of course, they're the foundations of rights. So in the absence of any other narrative that obligates us to care for ourselves and for others as we age, surely rights is the only one that we can really work to. And of course, why wouldn't we want that? Why wouldn't we want rights that treat people with respect and dignity? And with respect and dignity comes obligations to care and support for people. The second thing is, as I said to you, many of the rights, we assume that we have them, but they don't actually exist in law. And I'll give an example of that. Our whole new aged care system is based on the desire of most Australians to age in place. But to age in place, what does that actually mean? It means the right to affordable and accessible housing that you can actually live in as you age. Without that, there is no prospect of living or ageing in place. The second is we need services that are able to be delivered to where people live. And at the moment, there's not only a chronic shortage of those services with very large waiting lists, particularly in relation to the old former home care packages, or now supports at home, but for those in regional and remote Australia, that's always been a problem. And thirdly, and most importantly, we need a system that keeps us connected to our communities and to others who are within our network of influence and support. And most of our systems don't take any notice in relation to connectedness or relationships. So Australians talk about these concepts as it's a right to age in place. But the fundamental things that allow that to be exercised are often very fragile or non-existent. And so if we are going to make rights real for older people, I think we have to have a fair dinkum conversation about what those rights really are. Are they able to be enforced in law? And if they're not able to be enforced in law, we have enough, I suppose, arrangements to ensure and safeguard that they can be exercised in practice? In practice, what we're doing at the Commission is looking at 3 or 4 streams of activity. One of those, which Sue is co-chairing with me, is the Human Rights as We Age, which is looking at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People, the eventual establishment of a human rights framework, including a Human Rights Act in Australia, and a reform of our discrimination systems across the 9 jurisdictions over time. So that's about one area. The second area is about looking at the rights of older workers, people that are engaged in the workplace. Australia has an urgent economic need to increase the labour force participation rates of older people. Between around 60, about 63% of men and about 57% of women are engaged in the workforce. By 65, that drops to 20% for men and 13% for women. The economy can no longer afford that. But for many older people that they wish to work longer and financially need to work longer as our age pensioners move to 67 years of age. But I could go into a workplace and say, well, you're discriminating against older people. And in a joint research that the Commission did with the Australian Human Resource Institute, the last survey showed that employers are now seeing older workers at 51 years of age. 10 years ago, they regarded older workers as 61 years of age. So we've got a completely counterintuitive movement by business at the very time that older people and the economy now needs more older people to be engaged. It's unlikely that me going and battering on the door saying you're discriminating is going to make a difference. And so that approach is to talk about inclusive, age-inclusive or inclusive multi-generational workplaces where all people of all ages are valued and where we create respectful and supportive environments so that older people can in fact continue to be retained longer, can be recruited and ultimately can retire with dignity. And that's where the rights really do matter. Yes, there are laws around discrimination in the workplace, but it's actually about trying to create a different culture within our employment spaces. In that way, we think that the rights of older people in the workplace can be protected. It's not about older workers continuing to work forever on the same pay, in the same roles, and at full time. But it is recognising that adjustments need to be made and can be made by employers and employees as we age. Interestingly, at the moment, the Commonwealth Government's identified that the two biggest groups at risk in relation to employment are women aged 55 years and older, and that won't surprise anyone in this room, and young men. For the first time, we're now starting to see active discrimination re-emerging in relation to young men within the workforce. Now, what's behind both of those is different forms of ageism. It's about stereotypes, it's about biases, but what it will ultimately do is further fracture the workplace and, of course, Australia more generally. Another one is looking at the rights to live free of abuse. So all the states and territory governments and the Commonwealth are engaged in various programs and activities around elder abuse. The national plan, which is now 2.5 years late, is due for release very shortly. I say with a smile, but it is. And that will give us some guidance as to what the 9 governments have agreed in relation to elder abuse. But the area we're focusing on is the increasing level of financial elder abuse. That is, the abuse largely by sons and daughters and intimate partners of older people. And the very real risks are associated with growing old, particularly from about 75 to 85 years of age. Now, it's no good talking about the right to live free of abuse unless you have systems in place that both can prevent abuse but also respond to it. So again, if we want to talk about rights in practice, is what are the things we have in place around Australia that is likely to reduce the risk of you and I in our old age being abused, often by the people we should trust most? What's going to be in place when others, particularly frontline workers, identify that abuse is occurring? Where will they take those matters? And just taking them to the police won't be the answer. And so one of the things we've been recommending is adult safeguard units be established in every state and territory. And they do exist within the Human Rights Commission here in the ACT and in South Australia and in New South Wales, but nowhere else. And then it's talking about responses of the banking groups and so on to be able to not only alert people to the risk of abuse, but also to respond to it. So we now are working towards a collaborative which is made up of the banking industry, superannuation industry, financial services groups, financial counselling, financial planners, financial advisors, chartered accountants, lawyers and others to try to come up with a way that we can genuinely work with governments to respond to this issue. Again, there's no real rights to live free of safety in Australia, but let's assume it is, and this is one area. And then lastly, I just want to talk about the care systems. One of the great challenges in the care systems that we've identified is what's called ageism. Ageism is the way you think, the way you feel, the way you act towards people based on age. The way you think is around the stereotypes, the way you feel is around the prejudices and biases, and the way you act is around the discrimination, the behaviours. And we've done a report that was recently released which shows the chronic level of ageism in the healthcare system. And what that does is it denies people the right to have a say in their own care. And you all know about that. You go into a hospital today in Canberra, and we know that older people will be sitting there whilst their family members and carers and the health professionals are having a discussion about your care, with you having very little say in it. But worse than that, we now know that there are biases in the clinical decision making. Some treatments are not even offered, yet alone having your voice in it. And so clinical governance is a very big issue. Again, the rights of people in the healthcare system, and the Human Rights Commission deals with the healthcare complaints as well. You know this stuff. But again, how do we change the culture in those places? How do we change it? So we're launching these workshops to work with frontline workers that will make a change. But then we're using that to actually try to look at service-wide and system-wide changes. And that will take a long time. And then if you look at aged care, the same thing. We know that ageism is endemic in the aged care system. How do we change those cultures using the new framework that I've referred to? So again, if we're talking about rights of older people made real, it's actually changing the places in which they work, the way in which they live, the services that are provided. And that's the great challenge. I suppose you could say it's about right-mindedness. Let me just conclude, but as a stark reminder, in South Australia a little while ago, but only announced this week, they've just changed the law to remove the oversight of the South Australian Administrative Tribunal in relation to the removal of patients that are stranded in hospitals and moving them into aged care. So in South Australia, you had to have orders that would allow the forcible removal of a person from hospital by a guardian. That's just been changed. And now the carer or the substitute decision maker can do this. But the language is this: to authorise the detention of the person for the progress of transporting, for the purpose of transporting them to hospital, from hospital to an aged care facility. And further, to authorise the person's detention in an aged care facility where it is deemed reasonably necessary. Who in their right mind in 2025 believe it's appropriate to talk about the detention of older people and both in transportation and in aged care? And of course the group they're talking about here are largely those that have some cognitive decline in particular people with dementia. And so here is a completely out of the blue piece of legislation, removing the safeguards, effectively removing the rights of older people, happening as we talk. Where would that have come from? I suspect it will have come from carers. I suspect it will have come from carers that have said the tribunal is too messy, it's too difficult. We need to be able to move mum or dad more quickly. And yet the rights of mum and dad have just about been destroyed completely, if they had any to start with. So again, we can talk about these rights, but right at the moment we need to make sure that our systems and our legislation is appropriate and truly protective. And my very last comment is older people, can't be onlookers in their own lives. They have to be part of the decisions that affect them. They can't be bystanders in the design of the systems that are meant to be supportive of them. They have to be part of the design of those systems as we go forward. And I think the only way all of that will really happen is if we embrace enforceable rights which underpin the right of people to have both presence and voice in the decisions and the systems that affect them. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert, for a very insightful and engaging presentation. I was watching very impressed that he had hardly any notes and he was just speaking. Very impressive. So we've got two more voices going to join us on the panel now, Sue Hendy and Karen Toohey. So please come up and join us to introduce those two new voices. Sue Hendy, who's in the spotted shirt there, has... Not black, yes, not the lady in black, has worked in the field of ageing for most of her 40-year career in many settings and diverse roles: residential care, rehabilitation, local and state government, advocacy, non-governmental organisations for older people, university lecturer, and a member of numerous committees and working groups of government on matters important to older people. Ms Hendy was CEO of the Council on the Ageing Victoria for 15 years and has been a director of the International Federation on Ageing for 2 terms. She hosted the IFA Global Conference in Melbourne, has attended the UN Working Group on the Rights of Older People and has been a strong advocate in Australia. So delighted to have you, Sue, come and join us. We're also privileged to have my colleague Karen Toohey, who is the ACT's Discrimination, Health Services, Disability and Community Services Commissioner, as well as the Information Privacy Commissioner. And she has had an extensive career in human rights, including Acting Commissioner and CEO of the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, roles within the Australian Human Rights Commission, and Deputy Commissioner of the Australian Office of Information Commissioner. So a stellar panel to have a bit of a discussion before opening up to you and your questions. Okay, so panellists, we have microphones which you can turn on. Hopefully we won't start a whole lot of feedback. If we have them, if we do, we'll just turn them off again. So, Robert, you mentioned the concept of ageing, and you described it as the way we think and feel about certain ages. So I want to begin by asking the panel, well, you've told us a bit about how it impacts in health. Are there other impacts for older people of ageism? And I guess we're all desiring to know how we change this. And the answer might be human rights, but will we start with Sue and then move to Robert?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Robert, for your presentation. I enjoy hearing you every time. There's so much that you give us. And I think the whole issue of ageism and age discrimination, we haven't had the discourse in our community about what ageism looks like and how it affects us. And I think that that's something, we can talk about feminism and women's rights, and we kind of have a sense of that because we've been having a conversation for some years now. Age discrimination and ageism is still new to us. So the way I usually introduce it is to say, I'm 80 years old, I go to the GP and say, I got this problem with my knee. His response is, what do you expect at your age? And I would say, my other knee is 80, and it's got no problem. So what's wrong with this one? So for me, that helps me get into the issue of, so we're being treated differently by our age. I recently heard of a woman who had broken her arm at 71 years of age. As they were bandaging her up and sending her home, they said, if you were younger, we would operate on this. Now, it may be that there were some causal issues that they hadn't told her because of these reasons we can't do it, but she went home thinking, because I'm 71, and it could have been. So I think there's rationing, there's all sorts of things that go on in our society because of ageism. We have connected capacity and age. So the older you get, the less capacity you have. Not true, but that's what we often believe. And it comes out in all sorts of ways. We also still have lots of jokes and humour. They're not humour. There's lots of people telling us things that are so-called jokes that are actually very ageist. We have all sorts of jokes around memory loss. Now, that's not funny. And all sorts of, and I'm not even going to try and tell any of them. But we have ingrained in ourselves that age equates loss of capacity. Inevitable, can't do anything about it, and it starts at 50. Not true. And we know that. We know people who don't fit that stereotype. Most of us don't. But we actually start to go, oh, well, I'm 50, I don't have to do that anymore. At 60, I don't exercise. That's for young people. There's all sorts of things we've connected to getting older and disconnected or said we can't do those things. So I think that, for me, is an important part of the world that we live in, that we have to challenge ourselves every time we go to tell a joke about ageing. Hang on, should I be telling that? Because it actually reinforces the stereotypes and it impacts our future selves. It impacts what we can do in the future or will be done to us in the future, because I think the system has embraced the worst of ageism. So I think that's, for me, we can change ourselves and at least one person every other day.
Any further comments from other panellists on that particular question?
Only the last point is that internalised ageism is the most dangerous and debilitating of all forms. And so ageism is often what people do to you. What happens is, particularly in the health and aged care system, is you internalise the deficiencies that people seem to have or think about you. And so one of the things in the study on healthcare is if the doctor keeps doing what Sue's been saying, if the people don't listen to you and they only listen to your carers or others, if in fact they say it's all because you're getting older, and you start to internalise that and believe it to be true, you will in fact start to have less voice and less presence, and you'll withdraw yourself. So it's actually quite a dangerous form of ageism. Ageism that happens to you often then becomes ageism that you internalise, and that's the hardest, greatest challenge we've got, is to make sure that we, as we age, don't internalise those negative perceptions that surround you, as well as trying to directly deal with those that are actually exercising that ageist approaches, as we've been talking about.
Robert, staying with you, the work on the UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, why is it important? It's very early days, obviously, but what do you think it will cover? Will it go beyond anti-discrimination laws in this country, and if so, how?
So most of the United Nations conventions that we have are not based on just discrimination. In Australia, we have almost a unique position that instead of having a Human Rights Act, we have 4 pieces of discrimination law at the Commonwealth level: sex, race, age and disability. Normally that's not the case, and that's not the case necessarily here. So the United Nations Convention will be a much broader document. If you want to think about it, it will probably replicate many of the provisions of the Universal Declaration on the Rights of People with Disability. That's a good one to think about. And it'll be why it's important is it frames what we do in Australia. When they came to the Aged Care Reform Act, as it was then called, but it's different, they had no basis. They went around and looked at all sorts of different conventions. And as I say, it's a mixture of human rights and that. If we'd had a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People, that would have shaped and framed the sorts of rights you'd expect to see in that law. And the fact that we don't have that actually means that we make it up as we go. Every time there's legislation dealing with older people, it's made up. And we think a United Nations Convention would change that. The second thing is it would, in fact, I think, really encourage a widespread approach to a rights-based approaches in legislation across the 9 jurisdictions. It's happening by stealth, but I think United Nations Convention would make a very big difference. And the evidence of that is the disability one. I was the Ageing Disability Commissioner in New South Wales. I've been around disability a very long time. I can't tell you the impact that that United Nations Convention had. It fundamentally changed the way Australia dealt with people with disability. Now, it won't have the same dramatic effect for older people, but it will have an effect, and so I think it's very important. And the last one is, universally, older people should be treated with the same respect and dignity as children, as young people, as Indigenous peoples, all the groups that we have conventions for. So I think it equalises that level of respect and dignity on an international scale.
Thank you. Any further comments from the panel that you wanted to add? No?
Bring it on.
It's a degree of self-interest.
Yes.
We won't be self-interested.
Yeah.
That's all right.
I suspect from all the panel and many of our audience members today, yes. So perhaps a question for Karen now. Discrimination based on age is prohibited under the ACT's Discrimination Act. Abuse of vulnerable older people is both a crime under ACT law and is one of your complaint jurisdictions under the Human Rights Commission Act. What sort of complaints do you see in this area, and are those legislative provisions sufficient to protect older people in the ACT?
So in the first couple of years, we got about 50 complaints a year. This year, we're looking at 160. So it's a small jurisdiction, but they're really difficult matters. They're very tricky matters to deal with, and they're really sad often. So as you said, Robert, adult children helping themselves to inheritance early, adult children moving mum into a shed out the back, turning the power off.
There's a little bit of construction going on there.
But the good thing that we see, and I think some of my colleagues in the audience are aware of this, We see neighbours giving us a call to ask us to go out and do welfare checks on people. We have some of our health colleagues giving us a call when they have people come into the hospital who are in poor condition or they're concerned about the family relationships. So there's a whole range of matters that we see. We're one of two jurisdictions that have a complaint mechanism. We're one of the adult safeguarding services. Do we need more reform? Yes, that's why we're getting the complaints. We're looking at that at the moment to strengthen our ability to take matters to a tribunal. On the other hand, we're only a couple of years into this, so I think it's a significant advantage in the ACT for us to have the jurisdiction, but at the same time, it requires a lot of work. It's very nuanced work. It's going into people's homes, dealing with their families, dealing with their, as I said, inheritance issues. So it's tricky work.
And thank you for doing it, Karen. We all and to members of the team who are here. Hopefully you've all been thinking of some questions, and I can see Bill has one right off the bat.
Ask for that particular one. If there are 50 cases in the ACT, what do you roughly estimate the number of cases around Australia would be?
Everybody
so
hear
I think,
that?
Robert,
or
you...
yeah.
So in age discrimination, it's the least reported area of discrimination. This is ignoring elder abuse specifically. It's the lowest rate. It's about 5% of all the complaints to the Australian Human Rights Commission. It would be in the 300 or 400, not a lot. And we don't know what the reason for that is. We know that discrimination of older people or people based on age. I should just make the comment: age is not defined. It's from 0 to death. So it includes age discrimination at all ages. We think that older people are not reporting discrimination against them, and either they don't believe anything will change, or nobody will take any notice, or in the employment workspace it'll actually be negative to their position. But it's very low relative to disability discrimination at the national level. But it is increasing, but it's still quite low.
Robert, your commission, though, gets thousands of reports about elder abuse in New South Wales, which is...
New South Wales, the Ageing Disability Commission, which is a state-based, so it's not the Commonwealth one, it deals exclusively with preventing and responding to abuse of both adults with disabilities and older people. Two facts about that: 75% of the matters it deals with are, in fact, older people, and it's getting, at the moment, about 14,000 inquiries to its helpline, and that converts into 7,000 or 8,000 complaints. And this is complaints about abuse in the community, not in institutions. So elder abuse is rising, both in terms of recognition and reality, and the adult safeguarding units here and there and in South Australia, are showing the increase in demand. So abuse and discrimination are two different things, and dealt with differently.
And if I can...
There is a major problem around Australia that isn't being addressed, is what you're saying.
In relation to discrimination...
Can I just ask our audience members to use the mic, because we've got a big audience online too, So,
in relation to discrimination, every state and territory has an Equal Opportunities or a Human Rights Commission, and all of them deal with age discrimination. And so there is a place to go for discrimination. In relation to abuse of older people, it's very fragmented. The only three states that have a really coordinated approach is ACT, New South Wales and Queensland. The recommendations, I hope, in the National Plan for Prevention of Elder Abuse will encourage that, and we have been advocating strongly for adult safeguarding units. The governments have to start to take seriously the well-being of older people and people with disabilities that are abused in the community. So a lot of attention about abuse in aged care and healthcare and everywhere else, but the highest level of abuse actually happens in your own home. And governments have got to start to say, we care about our older people, and they don't. At the moment, if they don't have to pay the money to care for older people, they won't. That's got to change.
In addition, it's very disparate in how the data is collected, so it's hard to know. In Victoria, Seniors Rights Victoria, which I set up with one of our colleagues here, we were fighting for data to be collected centrally so we could get a picture of it. But as Robert says, it's very much in the home. And I think in terms of why people don't report is they often think it's their own fault. they think, well, it's because I'm old or because I've done something wrong, you know, and we know that in other jurisdictions. But it's alive and unfortunately a lot in our community.
And I should just say there was one prevalence study which was done 2 years ago by the Australian Institute of Family Studies. It showed that 16% of older Australians, that's over the age of 65, identified as having been abused in the last year, and they identified as it being significant abuse. Now, one-off studies are dangerous, but that's 1 in 6 older Australians identified they were abused in the last year. We need to do more prevalence studies before you can validate that, but that's very high, much higher than I thought, but it is consistent with what researchers thought would be found.
I think one of the other problems that we discovered was there was actually systems failure in other parts of the health and community sector that led to people's abuse. So an older person of 50 who was having mental health issues, alcoholism, was in care. They were pressured for beds, so they went, oh, well, he's got a mum, he can go home. Mum's 80, he's got all sorts of behavioural issues, so she's now locked herself in a bedroom, scared to go out. Money's being stolen, cars being stolen, but it was really back in a different sector that was failing that brought that into being.
I've got a question here from
Well,
Beatrice.
I have a comment and a question. My comment is, with regard to ageism, you should look at Japan. I taught there for 20 years, and I was employed by the head of the university. The age was 93. At meetings, all my younger colleagues often went to sleep. He never did. The retirement age was, and still is, 72. On Japanese television, you have elder people come out pretty prominently. There is a famous surgeon, also in his 90s, running a hospital and actually showing people the exercise they have to do, those who are in wheelchairs, how to be able to walk again. So I think the media should be used, needs to be used, and a lot of my colleagues, when they retire at 72, say, well, I can finally do what I want to do. I'm going to open a noodle shop and, you know, make your own ramen and so on. So
Any responses from our panel?
Well,
Thanks.
we did a research piece 2 years ago, 18 months ago, called Changing Perceptions, where we interviewed the media themselves, the journalists, editors, proprietors, and they identified exactly what you would know, that most of their stories are negative about older people. It's about deficits and it's about burdens on younger people. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part was why. And in the media is the youngest industry profile, youngest workers. And they said to us that we have never had a conversation with an older person, and we've never had a conversation with senior management about how we present ageing. They simply took the language of the street, and the language of the street is the language of social media, which is negative. And so that was a real insight to us, and we've started to work on that. They actually recognised that they were portrayed, you and I, in very negative terms, not always, but the reasons were very interesting. So we're working with the media to try to make a change, but that will take a long time. But they recognise that.
Yes, there are
I have a question.
Okay, one more, and then we've got some more over here.
It's about aging in place. You know, when you get older, you're told to sign this eternal power of attorney, which everybody responsible older person does. And then comes a point of conflict where the person wants to age in place, but the very benevolent relative who's got a friend, power of attorney, says, off you go to a home. You know, they don't want the responsibility. The person might have fallen or something. So what are the rights of these people who suddenly are turned off into a home and their beautiful flat is being sold or house? And, you know, can they revoke their power of attorney? But the problem is that these people usually don't have the energy to actually contact the Human Rights Commission. So how can these people be informed that they have power? And of course, you know that with dementia, there are periods of absolute clarity and periods of confusion. And so it's in the periods of clarity, they say, how terrible, this is not where I want to end my life.
Thank you for the question. We'll allow the panel and we'll take the mic and put it over here.
Yeah, look, and they're very difficult situations. They're ones that we deal with on a regular basis. I think one of the things that we're trying to deal with at the moment is facilities like aged care or respite requiring people to have an EPOA, because that facilitates abuse. And so we are trying to get out and about so that people know they can come here. One of the things that we do on a regular basis is work with what we call first responders, so ambulance, police, those guys, so that they know to refer people to us. And so in the ACT, people do have some protections. EPOAs can be really complicated, and certainly we see the matters where there's conflict between family members. My colleague Liz sitting behind you, that's her day-to-day business, dealing with those matters. And so it is really complex, but I think, again, one of the issues that we deal with is the requirement for people to have those sorts of documents in place when it's not necessary.
But very importantly, you can revoke powers of attorney. Absolutely. We did a survey, we did research in relation to EPOAs, and most people that have entered into a power of attorney don't understand that they can actually revoke them and should. The problem is every state and territory has a different way by which revocation takes place. And even I, as a lawyer, have no idea how you revoke powers of attorney in some states. So, yes, you should, you should, but it's a mess.
Thank you. I think we've got time for perhaps one more question.
Okay, hello. Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is, I'm standing up because I'm quite small. My name is Sonia Demetsa. I'm the CEO of the Migrant and Refugee Settlement Services, also a board member of Amnesty International Australia and a board member of Help Age International. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Help Age International was part of the huge civil society force and energy that advocated for that convention, and we're so excited that there will be a convention. Commissioner, I want to say your speech was so clear, just really set out the issues in my mind for someone who's been advocating on the rights of older people, and I'm really thankful for that. One comment I want to make was that I was once advocating for an older person who was being forcibly drugged to get into transportation to be flown to another nursing home, which she didn't want. And the tribunal here in the ACT was eminently helpful and said, you cannot do that. And I'm saddened if there are movements to try and weaken that legislation across Australia. I want to ask you, one of the big driving factors against elder abuse is a national register and national legislation relating to enduring powers of attorney. How far are we towards that, and do you think that's a good thing? And one just quick thing for Sue, I want to say I absolutely agree. This fight against ageism has to come from within, and we have to start. I'm 53, so I guess in the workforce I'm considered very old, but we have to start thinking that we have so much wisdom and knowledge and expertise to contribute, and that's a good thing, because Australia is ageing, we're living longer because of the medical technology. There's so much to contribute, and I don't think 65, that cut-off is, it must be the time you retire. I don't think it's relevant anymore. Thank you.
So, quick one on the last one. Just think about longevity. One of the new terms you're going to hear a lot about is how much longer we're living, and Australia has to adapt to the fact that we are now living much longer. And so you're seeing a lot of stuff around longevity economy, the challenge of longevity. But it's a good way to think about it. We have to adjust to that. The second thing, just say about enduring powers of attorney, all of us, I'm sure, are committed to getting nationally consistent enduring powers of attorney. We think that registration should follow shallow. Where are we up to with that? Every few months, the Attorney Generals of Australia meet. Every few months, they send out a communique. And every few months, it's exactly the same words, progressing. It hasn't progressed at all. And I've said to the government the other day, you cannot continue to say it's progressing when there's no evidence that it actually is progressing. So we're going to really, really ramp up with the banking sector, superannuation, lawyers, colleagues in the states next year, a push on both the Commonwealth Government and the states and territories to get this job done. But I am not at all certain it'll happen in my lifetime. It is the one thing, it's a low-hanging fruit, it's not complex, it can be done, it's been recommended over and over again. The only thing is the lack of inertia, both at a bureaucratic and political level. We've just got to break it.
Can I suggest everyone in this room ring their local MP and ask for it? Let's see if we can get some movement.
I think there was, Chris, I'm sorry, I can see so many people now want to ask questions, but there's a lady just right here who had her hand up for quite a while.
My name's Chin Wong. I'm from the Canberra Multicultural Community Forum. I just want to ask, you talk about the data collection, talk about data. You know, from the multicultural community perspective, you know that the reporting of the elderly abuse is very low. Mainly is because of the culture, and also a lot of the parents relying on their children when they migrate here, especially from the financial point of view. Do you have any data that that really sort of can look at from the multicultural, from the cultural perspective, that we can work on educating our communities?
So the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commission collects data by cultural groups. Yes, we have that. You're absolutely right, it's very low, but it's not zero. They are reporting. Abuse takes place in all cultural communities, but the entry point for discussion around elder abuse or the abuse of people with disability is completely different in each culture. And so it's a very difficult area, but yes, we are collecting data, and that's very important, and it's available. I think South Australia would do the same.
Yeah, we do the same, yeah. We have the data, but because it's a very small cohort, we don't make that public at the moment.
And I might say there's a different communities have higher rates of abusing people with disability than they do with elder abuse, and it's quite different, but it's available. It's a very important story. Can I just make one last comment? The biggest problem we have in multicultural communities is the issue of shame. And one of the things we have to do is we have to work with communities to break through that barrier. I'm not saying the communities shouldn't feel shame. If they want to feel shame, they'll feel shame. But we can't let that be the cause for the older person to be the only person that shame actually affects. You cannot, as a family, as a community, as a church, say, well, it's shameful and we shouldn't talk about it. If the only person that's been adversely affected is the older person, or the person with disability, or the child. And so we understand why there's such a reluctance to come forward, but you have to work with community by community to try to work through that. What is not acceptable is older people left in positions of abuse in multicultural communities simply because the family will feel shame. That can't be acceptable. How you work through that, very difficult.
All right, I have learnt my lesson from the last forum, which you will remember because everybody had lots of questions. I let it go on for too long. So I'm going to close proceedings now, and we've got time to mingle and eat some more refreshments. But please join me in thanking our three panellists, Robert, Sue and Karen. I think we've been very privileged to have such eminent and knowledgeable speakers, but I also want to thank the staff of the Human Rights Commission, particularly Chris Carney, who's done so much in organising this day, our interpreters and the caterers and the staff of Old Parliament House. And that's a wrap.